Smart Drivers, Rick with Smart Drive Test, talking to you today about driving in Australia, learning how to drive a coach in Australia. And we're going to continue with those stories today and give you some more information about that. Stick around, we'll be right back with that part of the story. Hi there, Smart Drivers. Rick with Smart Drive Test. We are on day 14 of the lockdown. There is some chatter, as they call it, that they're going to start opening the economy again here soon, within the next week or so. Let's hope so. If you're just tuning in, let us know where you're tuning in from in the world. If you're going for a license, if your license has been postponed, if there's anything at all we can help you with, pursuing a CDL license, starting a career as a truck or bus driver, doing air brakes, needing defensive driving. We can help you with all of that. We're kind of hanging out here. I guess we're having coffee while the lockdown is here and, talking about stories of my driving career and how I became a driving instructor and started a YouTube channel. Carrie's here from Minnesota. Ryan's here from Saskatchewan. Awesome. So a few people here already. And so January 2002, I moved to Australia. We talked about some of that yesterday, some of the immigration challenges that I faced. If any of you've done immigration, I know that Ryan might have done immigration. It's a lot of paperwork and a lot of hoops to jump through. Some people who immigrate to other countries will choose to hire somebody. There are lawyers whose specialty is helping immigrants to get into another country and those types of things. If you're moving, you need a sponsor and those types of things. When I moved to Australia, I married an Australian before we had left there and been married for about a year at the time we got into Australia. So Janet's here from Ontario, and Frederick is here from Denmark. So we have quite an international audience, which is the awesome power of YouTube. I had to postpone going to university when I got to Australia because, as I talked about, I didn't have my permanent residency card, and I was a international student, and international tuition fees for universities are 3 to 4 times the amount that it is for a domestic student, for somebody who lives in the country and is going to go to university. Farron, my friend, is here. How are you? Tuning in from South Africa, where she cannot see the Southern Cross. And interesting enough, the Southern Cross is the star constellation. It's on the Australian flag. It's on the New Zealand flag. Both of those obviously are British. They're not British colonies anymore. That's the wrong term. Constitutional monarchy, still part of the British Empire, so to speak. But the Southern Cross can only be seen from apparently New Zealand and Australia, maybe some of the islands in the South Pacific there. South Pacific, is that correct? Not sure. I'd have to check that information. Don't quote me on that. I asked Farron, she's in South Africa, whether she could see the Southern Cross in the night sky. And when I first got there, I was somewhat enamored with the night sky because, I mean, here in the Northern Hemisphere where I live, I mean, seeing the Big Dipper is easy. It's just there in the night sky, or the Northern Star. And it's the same thing in the Southern Hemisphere. Once you find the Southern Cross, I mean, it's just there every night. You're just like, oh, there it is. It's so easy to find in the night sky. And as I said, it's prominent because it's on their flag. And I was with one of Amelia's friends, and we were standing out in the backyard, and we were barbecuing, and it was dark, and I guess it was cloudy too. And I asked him, I said, well, where's the Southern Cross? I said, I want to see the Southern Cross in the night sky. He couldn't tell me where it was. I did eventually figure out where it was because it's so easy to find. But the constellations, the star constellations in the night sky are completely different in the Southern Hemisphere. Completely different. So if you've been to one of the other hemispheres, south of the equator or north of the equator, know that the night sky is going to be completely different. And that's the other thing about going to Australia from Canada or North America or any other place in the world is that everything in Australia is different. Absolutely everything. They drive on the left side of the road. The institutions are different. The culture is different. The people are different. The trees are different. All of the plant life is different. The animals are different. Every animal is different. I mean, we all grow up in school learning about wombats and kangaroos and Tasmanian devils and platypus. and echidnas. You know, we grew up learning about all of those marsupials that don't exist anywhere else in the world. And you know, the platypus, for example, is a billed mammal that lays eggs, and it's a mammal, which is not the way that mammals are categorized in terms of animals in the world. And mammals they have fur, and they give live birth. They don't lay eggs. So it's the platypus is definitely an anomaly amongst the classification of mammals. Never did see a platypus. Did see wombats, kangaroos, lots of echidnas. Echidnas are kind of like a mini porcupine with a snout, and so did see those. Never saw red kangaroos though. I did see a lot of greys. Most of in Melbourne and Victoria, they're mostly greys. If you want, and I'll just back up a bit in terms of explaining kangaroos to you. There's grays and reds, and grays are a lot smaller. The tallest gray is going to get about 5 feet, maybe 6 feet tall, whereas most red kangaroos, which are found in the outback, are like 2 meters tall, and they can attack people, and they're a little bit more dangerous. You want to be a little bit more wary around red kangaroos, because the way that they attack you, which you may or may not know with kangaroos, is that they grab a hold of you with their front paws, they lean back on their tail, and then they eviscerate you with their claws on their back feet. So that's that's how they take you out. And I watched troops of kangaroos. Kangaroos, a group of kangaroos can be called troops, mobs, or a court, which is interesting. And I've seen them in campgrounds. You know, you get a troop of kangaroos, and they'll box and they'll fight, and they'll do that same thing where they grab a hold of the other kangaroo with their front paws. They lean back on their tail because the tail is the ballast, and lean back on their tail, and that's what they do, and they box and those sorts of things. Farron says if she was an animal, she'd be a platypus. Hockey Life is here, and Tommy, did I take a lot of stuff? No, we did not take a lot of stuff. We went down with a lot of stuff. We took our bicycles. I took my canoe, and I think we took about 1 pallet of stuff down with us, like kind of, 4x4 by 4 feet high. Most of the stuff that we took with us, we didn't have a car, we didn't have motorcycles, we didn't have furniture, we didn't take any of that stuff with us. It was just easier to liquidate everything, sell everything, and then just move down with basically, the canoe and the bicycles. That was basically all we took with us. And then we just bought the rest of the stuff down there. And I would recommend that for anybody who moves overseas, because I had a friend who lived on Vancouver Island with me, and him and his wife were from England. And, they bought these huge shipping containers, steel shipping containers, and loaded them up with all the stuff and shipped it over. And I know that you get attached to your stuff and those types of things, but, you can get into crazy amounts of money in terms of getting this stuff moved around and those types of things. And sometimes it's just easier to liquidate everything and then start over. But, my friend ended up with a bit of a complicated life because his wife went back to England, and he still had a house on Vancouver Island that he wanted. His mom was still living here, and, just complicated. Anyway, I'm off on a tangent. Carrie, never imagined that kangaroos as aggressive. Yes, kangaroos can be quite aggressive, especially the reds. Not so much the grays and wallabies. Wallabies are called the smaller kangaroos. And, if you want to see kangaroos anywhere in you won't see them in the cities. And funny enough, the first time I saw Australians on a bus get excited in town was we were driving into Canberra. We were coming into Canberra, and as some of you may or may not know, Canberra is the federal capital of Australia. I'll tell you a funny story about that too. And we were coming into Canberra, and all of a sudden the whole bus is like leaning out the left side of the bus, and they're like, "Oh my God, look at that, look at that!" And I'm like, "What the heck are you guys going on about?" And I look out the window, and there's a kangaroo bouncing across the road. It's just kangaroos in the city don't exist. And when I got to Australia, I didn't see a kangaroo for a couple of months. I actually had to go out of the city and go to a campground before I saw kangaroos. And I was pretty excited about it. But it's I think it's like those of us who live in Western Canada. It's kind of like us seeing a deer or seeing a marmite, or those who live in Ontario seeing groundhogs. I don't know what it would be for you, Farron, kind of common animals that are around all the time, in other places. Ontario, yeah, it'd be like seeing a groundhog in Ontario. For Australians, seeing a kangaroo is kind of like, yeah, whatever. And they're not extinct. I mean, Australia has about the same population as Canada. It's about 27, 30 million Australians live in the country. And like Canada, 75% of the population in Canada lives along the 49th parallel, which is the border between Canada and the United States. And in Australia, 75% of the Australian population lives on the Boomerang Coast. And the Boomerang Coast is Adelaide in South Australia, Melbourne in Victoria, Canberra, Sydney in New South Wales, and then Brisbane in Queensland. So that's kind of, you start in Adelaide and come across to Canberra, up to Sydney, up to Brisbane, and that's what's called the Boomerang Coast. 75% of Australians live in the Boomerang Coast. 27 million, 30 million. There's 100 million kangaroos in the country. They are not they are not extinct. They are not extinct in any stretch of the imagination. They are absolutely everywhere when you get out of the cities and into the outback, as they call it. So, yeah. Farron says she wants to go to Australia. Yep, very fun. Pick your places where you want to go into Australia, because it's a huge country, absolutely enormous. And funny story about that. Lots of people know about Uluru. They know about Ayers Rock. Uluru and Ayers Rock is the same thing. The British called it Ayers Rock, and then as they're assimilating, that's not the right word, as they're improving relations with the Aboriginals, they went back to the Aboriginal name, which is called Uluru. And people would go to Cooper Peter as it's spelled, but it's pronounced Coopapiti. And people would drive to Coopapiti and they'd be like, hey, where's Uluru? And the natives would be all like, 5 hours that way in a car. So it's really in the middle of nowhere. It's in the middle of nowhere. So know that there's huge spaces. It's kind of like people who come to Canada. They're like, oh, I want to go to Canada. I'm going to go see this and that. And it's like, really, you're not. It's a huge place. Geographically huge. And Australia is geographically huge. I mean, it's 11 and a half hour drive from Melbourne to Sydney, Australia. And I used to do that in the bus overnight. So, Ryan, I have an uncle immigrated there in Australia. He's in Darwin, Northern Territory. I wanted to visit there someday. I'll tell you a funny story about Darwin. When I worked at the bus company, there was another Canadian that worked there, and he was from Woodstock, which was interesting because that's Woodstock and London, Ontario, where I was from. They're only like 40 minutes apart. And he lived in Darwin, and he said they lived in Darwin for 6 months. And even in the middle of summertime, and I mean, this might not be a big deal for you, Ryan, because you're from the Philippines. I don't know how hot it gets in the Philippines, but in Darwin, which is northern Australia, which for those of us who live in Canada, it's it gets hotter as you go north. For us in Canada, it gets colder as you go north. So that's the other thing that's opposite, right? And so he was living in Darwin, and he said even in the middle of winter, he said it was 36 degrees Celsius, which is, here, let me figure that out for you. Temperature, here we go. 36 is 96 degrees Fahrenheit, 97 degrees Fahrenheit, and 90% humidity. He said even in the dead of winter, and he said he just couldn't live there. He said it was just too hot and too humid all the time. And he said, no, we moved to Melbourne. Which, is an interesting that, people say it's too hot to live somewhere. So that was his experience of living in Darwin. And so if your uncle lives there in Darwin, you might, take some sunscreen, make sure you wear lots of shorts and those types of things. And those types of things. Eric, my friend, 50s today in Minnesota, gradual melting snow. Yeah, we're actually supposed to go up to the low 70s here over the weekend. It's going to be super nice here in British Columbia, so I'm very much looking forward to that. So I got a job driving in March with Greyhound. It was actually Moorland bus lines, as you can see there on the thumbnail. There's two buses sitting there. One is a Greyhound Australia, and the other one is a Moorland's bus line. And it was actually Moorland's bus line. They were the company in Melbourne that had the contract to run the bus routes for Greyhound. And that was an exact picture. I looked that up on the internet yesterday, and it was the exact picture of the place that I worked at Moorland Bus Lines. And those were the buses that I drove. So I got an interview. I went in, and I had to go for a road test with Alex, the manager. And, the first bus was that copper color bus, and I went out on that, and it was fine. And then he threw me into another bus because, one of the things about the busing company that I worked for, they were not a standardized fleet, and which I just don't understand at all, because there's, you just save so much money in having all of the same vehicles in a fleet, because, when you're maintaining a fleet, for example, say for example that on the Kenworth truck that at 80,000 miles the fuel pump goes on the engine. So, if you've got a standardized fleet and they're all Kenworths, you've got a fuel pump sitting on the shelf in the shop. And, when the fuel pump goes, you just pull it off the shelf, put it on the truck, and away it goes, and you order another one. When every vehicle is different, you're trying to, first of all, you got to train your staff, because every vehicle is different. You got to train your mechanic staff. And then second, you got to order in parts every time, and it's going to take time, and you're going to have delays and those types of things. So if you're ever thinking of opening a busing company or a trucking company, make sure that you standardize your fleet, because it's just a crazy amount of money involved in having different vehicles for everyone. Not only that, you have to train the drivers. Every vehicle that I got in was different. I mean, they had a range of vehicles from synchromesh transmissions, air over electric, non-synchromesh transmissions. It was just a dog's breakfast, as it's kind of called in the industry. So, Farron, I do not see any animals in my cities or towns. However, when I am driving on rural areas and country roads, I see goats, sheep, cows, and bulls. Awesome animals, but sadly easy to accidentally hit them. Yes, and you do not want to hit one of those animals, because they get a lot bigger as they're coming towards you. Just writing something down here, a note so don't forget. There we go. Okay, Hall Phase, how are you, my friend? So, what was the story? So yes, so the first one the first bus I go out on, everything's fine. It was, it was a kind of a semi-automatic. It had a clutch for first and reverse, and other than that, it just shifted by itself. Royal Rooter. Some of the buses were used, some of the buses were new. We did have a few on the Greyhound run that were brand new buses. They were really nice buses. They did tell me that they had 430 Detroit engines in them, which I had run, most of my career when I was driving truck. That was kind of industry standard in the early 1990s, was the 470 Detroits. I wondered where they got them from, because they did not have the power that the trucks had. But that's what they said. So, and I think that it was just poor planning over a period of time. This is what happens with a lot of fleets, truck fleets and bus fleets, is that just over a period of time they get a mishmash and a melee of different vehicles, and that's what they end up with, because there's no consistent planning. That they go and talk to a company, a dealership, and they say, listen, we're going to buy every vehicle from you. What can you do for us in terms of price? Right? They never say that. Or what can you do for us in terms of service, or those types of things. So make sure that, when you're buying vehicles, you've got a consistent fleet. And it was, and it's not just them. I've worked for other people too. The guy that I worked for on the island, Vancouver Island, same thing. He loved Kenworths. And I said to him one day, I said, why don't you just buy Kenworth trucks? All your trucks should be Kenworths. But no, he had a mishmash of different kinds of vehicles, Max and Internationals and Freightliners and everything, and like I said, it cost you a lot of money in terms of maintenance and whatnot. Epic. Speaking of Australian buses, does your heavy rigid license buses with trailers or otherwise you're going to get a multi-combination license? No, you could pull a trailer with that heavy rigid license that I had. It was a truck and trailer, so you could have a trailer, but I never pulled any trailers on the bus. It was just the bus. I did talk to a lot of other people. There was Kerry, he was a veteran driver. He pulled a lot of trailers. So he talked about, he said, he left a lot of trailers on the Hay Plain because, the brakes wouldn't work, or they couldn't tow the trailer or something. I don't know. So yeah. The second bus that I drove, and this is actually on the autobiography. If you go over to the website and click on the autobiography and read that, I tell this story about this bus that it was a synchromesh transmission. It was air over electric. Basically what it was is they pumped air through the shifter, so it felt like a real shifter. but it was actually just an electric that went back to a solenoid to shift the transmission. And, I couldn't get this thing going. I couldn't get it going. I couldn't get it shifting. And I was just like, what is going? I cannot figure this out. Anyway, Alex hired me just the same. And, this bus continued to torment me for a while. And the reason this bus continued to torment me for a while is the same reason that new drivers who are learning to drive non-Synchromesh transmissions, which is like a big truck and trailer, you only push the clutch in this much. You only push the clutch in an inch. And the reason for that is that you just need to break the tension on the clutch plates. Because the truck, or the transmission, is a non-Synchromesh transmission, which means that in order to shift the transmission, you have to line up three things. You have to line up the gear, the road speed, and the engine speed. If those three things don't line up, the transmission won't shift. And the other thing with those transmissions, in order to get them into first and reverse at a stop, you have to have the gears in the transmission, you have to get them to stop spinning so you can get the transmission into first and reverse. And the way they do that is there's a clutch brake on the clutch. So if you push the clutch all the way to the bottom on the firewall, you will engage the clutch brake and stop the transmission spinning so you can get it into first and reverse. And because of that clutch brake, you only push the clutch in this much, because if you push it in more than that, you start to engage the clutch brake, you slow down the transmission, and you'll get a rough shift. And this is one of the transitions for new drivers, is that they have to learn how to just push the clutch, tap, tap. Like a teaspoon on your noggin. And, it's a big transition, because you got to train your body to do that. Well, I've been driving truck for 5 years, and I always push the clutch in this far. Same thing, get into a Synchromesh transmission, get into the car with my girlfriend and drive home after she picked me up. And I'd stall the car because I wouldn't push the clutch in far enough, or I'd dump the clutch because I was driving a petrol engine. And she said, well, don't you drive? Don't you drive professionally? I'd be, yeah, this is completely different. So you got to kind of move back and forth. Anyway, this bus continued to just haunt me. So the first 3 months of driving coach, I was on probation. But, I really kind of got into the job. I really liked hanging around with people. I liked talking on the microphone and, kind of doing history and a little tour kind of thing. And I did a lot of research. I researched the Murray River. We went across the Murray River when we went up to parks in New South Wales. I talked about Canberra. Canberra was pretty funny. And I got on this bus. And I had a trainer for the first 2 weeks that I was driving coach. I went with another bus driver, Craig, who I also talk about in my autobiography because, as the Australians say, Craig was as rough as guts. He was absolutely as rough as guts. And he said to me when he was training me, he says, I have no idea why they picked me to do this. I said, what do you mean you don't have no idea? He says, oh, I'm leaving. He says, I'm giving this the ass. He says, I'm going off to be a postie to deliver the mail, right? And in Australian cities, posties ride around on little mopeds and they deliver the mail and, pretty funny. It's just a different part of their culture and institutions, right? And so, him and I, all kinds of weird things. He was just rough as guts and just one of those people that was just like, oof, you said that? Oof. He just... Anyway, you can go over and read the autobiography. I'm not really going to say that sort of thing. Epic, speaking of spelling, okay, you already answered that question. Are most buses or Greyhounds built the same? Are they pretty fancy? Eric, most of them are pretty fancy. The one that I drove was fairly fancy. It was nice. It was clean. I had a toilet. Especially the new ones. And, these goofy things are expensive. Like one of those coaches is $450,000 for one of those buses. I mean, they're not cheap. And they were pretty fancy. The other thing about the Greyhounds, just to explain the difference between a bus and a coach. A bus is just a bus. It just puts passengers on. A coach, a highway coach, has a toilet. Okay, so you have bus drivers and then you have coach captains. And I was considered a coach captain in Australia. And I figured out later that, a highway coach has a toilet on it. So the difference between a bus driver and a coach captain is simply a bus driver that sits on a bus all day and takes crap. Ba-dum-bum-bum. Epic. Speaking of non-synchromesh transmissions in Australia, they actually refer to Eaton Fuller Road Ranger gearbox, which is common on American trucks and in Australian, larger Japanese trucks like Hino 700. Yes, non-synchromesh transmissions are more or less the same the world around. Okay. Farron, how many transmission gears do trucks and buses typically have? I hear they have 16 or more. It really depends, Farron. You can get anything from 9 speeds, 10 speeds, 13 speeds, 15 speeds, 18 speeds. I've driven, in the buses, it was a little bit different. Some of them would have 6 gears. Some of them would have 8 gears. Some of them would have 9 gears. It depended. And then some of them would be, they would shift on their own. Others were synchromesh transmissions. It was all over the place. All over the place. Hall phase, who cleans the toilets and empties them? That's part of the cleanup crew. So when I drove coaches, Hall phase, you would go into the depot. There was a crew there. You would park the bus. They would clean it. They would empty the toilet. And then they would fuel the bus as well. And they would do any other kind of maintenance things that they had to do and those types of things. Ryan, how many gears did the bus you drove in Australia have? Does it have a low and high range? No, none of the buses, Ryan, had a high and low range. All the buses, as I said, they were all out. There was the run from Parks, New South Wales was non-synchromesh transmissions. Some of the other buses were, like I said, they were everything. But 9 speeds was the most common. Eric, unless you decide to custom build it. Christensen, speaking of what bus did you drive in Australia, do they have something similar to blah, 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 which, no. Like I said, Epic, I never really caught up on the types of buses and the models of buses because every one of them was different. Every one of them was different. Just about every bus was different. I mean, they did have an infinite number of buses, but for the most part, they were different. And that was the weirdest thing. And you just had to get in them and you had to get used to them. And this one with the Synchromesh transmission, this is the one that gave me grief. And so Craig, the trainer, he couldn't tell me why I couldn't get the bus to shift either. And it was finally after a period of time, like I think on my 4th or 5th run, I'm driving up from Melbourne. We're in Albury. It's called Albury. It's spelled Albury, which is the city on the state line between Melbourne and Sydney. And right in the intersection, there was a T intersection you had to turn left at. Right in the intersection, stalled it in the intersection. And it was only by coincidence that I think on the 4th or 5th run, I finally figured out what I was doing wrong with this bus. What I was doing wrong with this bus was I was only pushing the clutch in this far because that's what I'd been doing for 5 years in big trucks. And I realized that in order to get this bus to shift, you had to push the clutch right to the firewall, right to the bottom. If you didn't push the clutch right to the bottom, it wouldn't shift. Hall phase, where your passengers' luggage store overhead or in the belly of the bus. For hall phase, for most of the stuff, same as a plane. Larger bags were stored in the belly, and you loaded that when you went in to pick up passengers at the beginning, which was, you just kind of slid it into the bus. And then, they could have a purse or a carry-on, a knapsack, or those types of things. We did have overhead racks. It's the same as in Canada. Farron, so those people cleaning the toilets literally took crap from people. Haha, yes they did. Yes they did. All right, so we're getting near the half hour here. Just one thing I'm going to tell you. I'll tell you one more story. A funny story about toilets. Tomorrow on the live stream at 11, I realized that I missed a huge section of the story that I needed to tell you about driving with disabilities and my work at Parkwood Hospital and working with people to teach them how to drive vehicles with hand controls and people who had strokes, people who were missing limbs, people with brain injuries and those types of things. So tomorrow I'm going to back up and I'm going to talk to you about drivers with disabilities. I'm going to talk to you about the work that I did at Parkwood Hospital. So Eric, custom build the buses from scratch all the way down to trans to heated toilets. Yes, all kinds of stuff. And like I said, the buses were nice. And first story, this is just a little story. One of the buses I went into, we were on the milk run from Melbourne up to Canberra. And for those of you who don't know what a milk run is the run that stops at every flippin' little town on the way from one town to another. And essentially it was the milk run up through Shepparton, through the back way into Aubrey, and then the back way kind of up through into Canberra. And so I went in. So we're stopped in Shepherd, and we had a bit of we had 5 minutes layover to keep schedule. I go in the toilet to check the toilet to make sure it's clean, because that's my job en route. And went in the toilet, make sure it's clean. And of course, there's a bit of toilet paper on the floor, so I picked it up to put it in the rubbish bin. And the rubbish bin was inside the wall, so there was a metal flap that you pushed the metal flap in to put the rubbish in. And pushed in, didn't even think about it, come back out, and my finger slid down the side of the metal flap, and I cut my finger, like, badly. And of course, use this as a humor tool after you get to know Australians. Don't just go to Australians and say, oh, Australians are all convicts. Because, if I wanted to upset my wife, Amelia, who was an Australian, I just called her a convict. And wow, did the fireworks start then. So I knew to use it very sparingly with Australians, to call them convicts. But anyway, the story about cutting my finger in the bus while I'm en route to go to Melbourne, or to go to Canberra from Melbourne, I go up to find the first aid kit in the bus. Somebody had nicked the first aid kit. So I've got no first aid kit. Fortunately, there was a passenger on the bus who was nice enough to give me a kerchief and wrap my finger up. And so I call up dispatch, and they say, well, you can come back to Melbourne and we'll send you to the hospital and you get it fixed. I said, listen, I'm in Shepherd. I said, I'm halfway. I said, I might as well just drive to Canberra. So I drive to Canberra. I ended up going to the hospital and I ended up getting 2 stitches. But anyway, like I said, sparingly call Australians convicts. Don't just call them that, because, like I said, they take umbrage. Okay, Carrie, how did you figure out that you had to push the clutch all the way in so the bus would handle better? It was coincidence. It was sheer coincidence, Carrie, that I figured it out one day. Just random. I don't know. Okay, so the story about the toilet. So one of the problems that I encountered when I first started driving bus, in the first few months that I was driving bus, is that I would get Australians who would come and meet me at one of the pickup points, and they would be completely drunk blotto. And I had a couple of people who threw up on the bus. And, I tried to talk to my manager about it, and I said to him, listen, I got these people who are completely hammered drunk, and they're throwing up on my bus. And I said, what do I do? And they said, well, you can't refuse service. I'm like, oh my God, how can I not refuse service? Frederick, did you convert the seats to beds for night driving so that passengers could lay down and sleep? Frederick, no, they basically, it's kind of like sleeping in a plane, same thing. So one night I picked up this passenger. He was completely 6 sheets to the wind in Aubrey. He got on the bus because I couldn't refuse service. We didn't get 20 minutes down the road. He went in the toilet. He puked over every surface in the bus. And of course I had to stop. Passengers were complaining. I had to clean up, mop up the bus. We were like an hour late. And so I just, I was at wit's end about these people who were drunk on my bus and disrupting the rest of the people. And, I was complaining about this to Carrie, who was one of the veteran drivers. I really got along with Carrie, and Carrie was really my mentor in terms of helping me drive bus. And he said, I know how to handle that. He said, I'll tell you how to do it. So he said to me, he said, when they come up to the bus, he says, you just take their ticket and you look at their ticket and you go, oh, sorry, mate, this isn't your bus. Your bus will be along in 20 minutes. And let me tell you, I did that to this guy in Shepparton one night. He was he's just like falling down drunk, and he's like, oh, mate, sorry, it's not your bus. It'll be along in about 20 minutes. Oh, thanks very much. Have a good night. Blah, blah, blah. Got on the bus and drove away. Right? It was the best thing that ever happened. So a month later, I'm in Sydney. I'm loading up the passengers, and I'm putting the luggage on the bus and those types of things. And I'm kind of, eyeing people who are getting on the bus. And there's obviously a couple of guys over there, and the one guy is they're drunk, right? They're not like drunk, not like throwing up kind of drunk. And so I went over them and I said to them, listen, I know you guys have been drinking. I know you're partying. I said, I don't have an issue with that. I said, however, understand this is your first warning, your only warning you're going to get. I said, if you're disruptive on the bus, you are off the bus. I said, there's no more warnings. So this bus that we had was notorious for, after they changed the chemical in the toilet would overflow in the bus. Like flow down the corridor. And so we're on the milk run through Sydney, went through Liverpool, Parramatta, went through Parramatta out to Liverpool. Liverpool was on the outskirts of Sydney, Australia. And so we get out of Parramatta, we're coming out, and all of a sudden the toilet overflows. And the one drunk guy gets up and he's running up and down the aisle. He's like, the toilet's overflowing, the toilet's overflowing, the toilet's overflowing. I'm like, oh my God, mate, you got to sit down. Because in Australia, they have seatbelts on the buses. You have to sit down. You have to have your seatbelt fastened while you're driving the bus. Because they had a couple of huge, awful crashes in the late 80s that mandated seatbelt use on public buses. And I said to him, mate, you got to sit down. Okay, so he goes and sits down. He comes back up. He's like, the toilet's overflowing. The toilet's overflowing. And I'm like, dude, I said, mate, I can't do anything about it right now. I said, listen, we're 5 minutes away from the stop. I said, when we get to the stop, I'll take a couple of minutes. I'll clean it up. I said, it's not a big deal. I said, it's just clean chemical. Go and sit down. Well, he wouldn't sit down. He's just beside himself about the toilet overflowing. So finally, we get to the traffic light, and he wouldn't sit down. And this is the way that I dealt with some of these passengers who were just being absolute, unagreeable, to say the least. And so, the light goes to green. I'm sitting at the light. The light goes back to red. It goes back to green. It only takes 2 times sitting at a traffic light for it to cycle through before the passenger will sit down, because the rest of the passengers on the bus are like, they're just giving them the stink eye. So he finally sits down. We get to the thing. I said, listen, mate. I said, you're done. You're off the bus. And so he wouldn't get off the bus. He wouldn't show me his bag because I couldn't just kick him off the bus. I had to kick him off the bus and give them their luggage. And so I called the police, New South Wales Police. New South Wales Police, it's busy. They wouldn't be there for an hour. So I said to the rest of the passengers on the bus, I said, I'm sorry, he won't show me his bag. I can't get him off the bus. And I said, I've called the police. They're not going to be here for an hour. I said, you might as well get off the bus, have a cigarette, do whatever, go and find a cup of coffee, whatnot. I said, I'll clean up the bus and then we'll carry on when the police get here. So that only took about 20 minutes of standing outside with the rest of the passengers standing around and giving the stink eye about, not showing his bag. And finally, I popped the bin. He showed me which his bag was. And his mate, he says to his mate, he says, well, you're coming with me, aren't you? And his mate shoved him. And he says, screw you. He says, I'm going to Melbourne. So his mate left him there. And so that's what happened with the passenger getting him off the bus. I cleaned up the bus. I had another passenger while all this craziness was going on. This other passenger came on. I didn't look at her ticket the way I should have. And we're driving back and we're going past the turnoff to go to Canberra, and she said, oh, aren't you going to Canberra? I said, no, we're not going to Canberra. She says, oh, I'm on the wrong bus. I felt really bad because I dropped her off at the service station. I guess she made her way down or whatnot, but anyway, so that was the story of another drunk person on my bus, and the toilet's overflowing, and how I dealt with people. Frederick, all passengers out and the personnel converted to bus coach to a sleeping hotel on wheels. Yes, no, we didn't have anything like that, Frederick, but that sounds really great. Jonathan, good news, Rick. I'm going for drug testing for the ambulance job. Figured I'd at least drop by to share the news of my pre-employment screening. That is awesome, Jonathan. Congratulations. Keep us updated on how you're doing there. Fahrenheit will never get drunk and be in public place, especially a bus. Too many creeps that could take advantage of me. Luckily, I do not drink. Stay safe, people. Have a sober person with you. Yes. Awesome. So we'll leave it there. Like I said, tomorrow I'm going to talk about driving, teaching people to drive with disabilities or help people to retrain to go back to driving. So we'll leave it there. I will talk more about bus driving. I have more stories about bus driving if you want to be a bus driver. I'm sure Jonathan has some stories as well about driving bus and driving school bus. I had a lot of fun, like I said. Told a lot of stories about Australian history, and I'll tell you the story of Canberra, which is a fun story as well. One more story before I go. The first time I went into Canberra, and basically the way that it worked was we would go to the depot, we would drop the bus, the other driver would be there, and there was a car there that we drove back to the hotel. We stayed in hotels. And so we go back to the hotel, and the car is just sitting there. You can use it as long as the driver isn't using it to get back to the depot. So the other driver, one of the other drivers, was at the hotel as well, and he says, "Come on," he says, "well, you haven't been to Canberra before." He says, "I'll show you what's interesting in Canberra." And so we get in the car and we drive up Mount Ainslie. There's a hill, a big hill. It's kind of a tourist thing, and there's a lookout at the top and whatnot. So we get in the car, we drive up Mount Ainslie, and we get up to the top. We get out on the viewing area, and we're looking out over all of Canberra. And he says, he points, I guess Canberra. He points to the west, and he says, "Oh, over there's Melbourne." And then he points to the east, and he says, "Over there's Sydney." And he gets back in the car, and we drive back down the hill. Not a lie. That's how Australians feel about Canberra. They feel that there is nothing in Canberra worthwhile. So that's what I learned about Australians and Canberra. Ryan, wow, you really need a people handling skill when you're a bus driver. Yes, you do. Yes, you do, Ryan. It only takes one person to ruin a bus ride. That is very true, Hall Face. But there are ways to deal with them, right? And I'll tell you some more stories about handling passengers tomorrow. Jonathan, I had a shower overflowing with sewage at my rental property because the tenants upstairs poured grease down the pipes, baby wipe sex. Oh my God. Oh, that sounds really nasty. Janet, I wouldn't have the patience for people to be a bus driver. Too old, too cranky now. Oh, Janet, I'm sure you're not. You can be a cranky bus driver. There's lots of those. All right, so we'll leave it there for today. We'll see you tomorrow at 11. All the best, and remember, pick the best answer, not necessarily the right answer. Have a great day. Bye now.